Good evening, and thank you for joining tonight's web seminar featuring Dr. Sonia Nieto. It's nice to see returning GCLR participants, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy, and me, India Fraser, Language and Literacy doctoral student. We also have a research team who have worked with this project for approximately 4 years. GCLR has provided professional development to approximately 40,000 people through its live and archived seminars and has reached people in over 160 countries across the world. Global Conversations in Literacy Research is an active research study that attempts to understand the conversations around literacy, professional development, and learning in online spaces. If you wish not to be involved, please type your name in the chat area. The collected data will provide important information for understanding the nature of web seminars to share scholarship across the world. All data is recorded anonymously. During tonight's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them in the chat box, and Dr. Nieto will address these at the end of the presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in tonight's web seminar. So please use the star tool located to the immediate left of the slide and click your location on the map. Dr. Sonia Nieto is Professor Emerita of Language, Literacy, and Culture in the School of Education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, USA. Dr. Nieto's research focuses on multicultural education, teacher education, and the education of students of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, topics on which she continues to write and speak. The socio-political context of multicultural education, a textbook widely used in teacher education programs around the nation and beyond. Her recently published memoir, Brooklyn Dreams, My Life in Public Education, looks back on her formative experiences as a student, activist, and educator, and shows how they reflect and illuminate the themes of her life's work. Dr. Nieto's other books include The Light in Their Eyes, Creating Multicultural Learning Communities, Language, Culture, and Teaching, What Keeps Teachers Going, and Finding Joy in Teaching Students of Diverse Backgrounds. Dr. Nieto has received numerous awards for her scholarly work, teaching, and advocacy, including 6 honorary doctorates. She was awarded the Annenberg Institute Senior Fellowship in the Urban Education, a residency at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center in Italy, the Social Justice and Education Award from the American Educational Research Association, the premier professional organization for education researchers, and was also elected as a fellow of AERA. In addition, she was elected as a laureate of Kappa Delta Pi Honorary Educational Organization, a distinction limited to 60 living educators. She has been a visiting scholar at universities in the United States, Puerto Rico, and Spain. And in 2012, she served as the Wits-Claw Distinguished Scholar at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Dr. Nieto also received the Medal of Distinguished Service, the highest honor given by Teachers College, Columbia University. She was recently invited as an honoree for Inside the Academy, an online archive that recognizes the most influential scholars in education through their personal and professional histories, and was elected as a member of the National Academy of Education. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sonia Nieto and her presentation entitled Language, Literacy, and Diversity, the Imperative for All Teachers to Address Culture, Race, and Other Differences.
Hello, everybody. Well, you know, I'm not used to this kind of format, so bear with me. I'm used to seeing people's faces, so it's a little difficult for me. in my many years of teaching, I'm used to interacting personally, so I hope that we can have some conversation later on. So today I want to talk with you about language literacy and diversity and why all teachers need to address these differences, all kinds of differences. Because if literacy is a social process and not just a functional or mechanical one, then all teachers really need to be aware of all kinds of differences. Not only language, which of course we expect that language teachers would be aware of, but also other issues. So what are the other issues? Other differences, and these are just some of them. Gender, of course, place, which in the United States often refers to zip code, for example, where you live and how that influences your education and every other part of your life. Sexuality, social class, ability, religion, and language, of course. So these other differences are really important to address because we are not just one thing. All of us have multiple identities. So why is it important to address these differences? One is because of the rapid increase of diverse populations, not only in the United States, but around the world as well. Even countries that seem to be monocultural are no longer monocultural. And certainly that's true in the United States, which has always been a nation of immigrants. And also the influence that differences of race, ethnicity, social class, gender, language, and so on and so forth can have on student learning. And also the socio-political context of schools and society. So I'll be saying a little bit about all of these things. And the growing recognition that education is advocacy, that it's political, and that it must be about social justice. So I'm going to be referring to some of the work that I've done, that other people have done, and also an article that I wrote with Willis Hawley a couple of years ago called An Inconvenient Truth, Race Matters in School Improvement. And that was published in Educational Leadership in 2010. And we wrote the following. No one can be unaware of the shameful differences in the overall academic outcomes and graduation rates of many whites and some Asian American students compared with students of color. So given this recognition, one would expect that policies and practices related to students' race and ethnicity would be high on the reform agenda. Of course, there is widespread discussion of the so-called minority achievement gap, but ironically, solutions to on the public agenda are invariably colorblind. It's widely assumed that what works for white and Asian American students will work for students of color, that is usually Native American, Latino, and African American, if only we did it better and more often. And of course, we know that this is not the case. This is pure fallacy, because education is not colorblind, it's not gender blind, it's not language blind, it's not ability blind, and certainly not social class blind either. So the default setting for education in the United States is white, middle class, English-speaking, and able-bodied. And in other nations, the default is whatever the majority in power happens to be. So in the article that I wrote with Bill Hawley, we wrote, in order to maximize learning for marginalized students, we will need to recognize and be responsive to the inconvenient truth that race, and of course I would add all those other differences, influences teaching and learning in at least two important ways. One is that students' sociocultural backgrounds, experiences, and differences affect how they respond to instruction and curricula, and to all the other policies and practices in schools. And the second is that students' sociocultural backgrounds, experiences, and differences inform the assumptions that educators have about how students learn and how much they're capable of learning. So if you're of a particular background, it often happens that educators assume that you can learn only to a certain extent or only some things. And so it's not uncommon in the United States, for example, to find that gifted classes or honors classes are mostly filled with white students, middle-class students, English-dominant students, rather than with students of all backgrounds who enjoy the same kind of intelligence as anybody else. And so that often happens because of the assumptions that educators and society itself, because I don't want to put this on just educators, make about students from particular backgrounds. So how do culture, race, ethnicity, and other differences matter in student achievement? I would say that rather, I've always had a problem with the term the achievement gap, because it places the onus on students and their families and their culture and so on, rather than looking at the policies and practices that created the gap in the first place. So those are policies and practices in schools, but also in society. And so, for example, I always go back to this that Paulo Freire said. Paulo Freire was a visiting scholar at the University of Massachusetts when I was a new assistant professor in the early 1980s. He came back for several years. And I remember once he said, when talking about culture, he said, "I am my culture." And that is something important for everyone to remember, that we are our culture. But by that, he did not mean that he was determined completely by his culture, because we are not determined by our culture. But we are influenced by our culture. That is and I'm not talking about superficial aspects of the culture. I'm talking about the deep-seated kinds of values and also the social practices followed by a family and by a community. And so we are influenced by those cultures, but we're not limited to those. And I think we need to remember that as well. Also, this is from Gloria Ansaldúa, and it's about hegemonic language policies that can keep a people in, quote, its place, that is, powerless. And she wrote, "So if you really want to hurt me, talk badly about my language. I am my language." Now, of course, we're not just our language, but we are, our language is important to us. That's certainly the case for me. Knowing that I am bilingual, that I was brought up in Spanish, is very important. And yet, hearing people talk about Spanish, especially about Puerto Rican Spanish that I speak, it as a negative thing, it is very hurtful, as Ansaldúa wrote. It's hurtful and it's unfair. And so when students are bilingual or becoming bilingual, or the term that is that Ofelia Garcia has coined, emergent bilinguals, that is, that they are learning to be bilingual, that is an asset rather than a deficit, and yet often it is seen as a deficit. Or if people are bilingual or emergent bilinguals, but they speak a valued form of the language, then somehow they have more prestige. And so we have to get rid of these ideas because they get in the way of student learning. So another way to challenge conventions is to accept and build on students' languages and discourses rather than do away with them or ask parents to stop speaking the native language. I always ask teachers, look, rather than asking families to stop speaking their native language, whatever that happens to be, whether it's in the United States or anywhere else, please ask them to keep speaking it, because that is a firm foundation upon which to build literacy. It's really, really important. And I always give the example of my mother, who was often asked to speak only English to us at home. And I'm so grateful that she never followed that advice, because that way I am bilingual, so are my children, and some of my grandchildren are as well. Some of them speak only Spanish at home, and yet they are completely fluent in English as well, because it doesn't take away when you have another language, it adds. So these hegemonic language policies really can keep a people in its place. For example, when you have, as we do in Massachusetts now, an English-only policy. You know, I was very proud when we moved here in 1975, because Massachusetts was the first state to mandate bilingual education. And unfortunately, in 2003, it became one of the first to eliminate bilingual education because of these misconceptions about bilingual education, that it would get in the way of student learning. And yet the research that's been done since that policy took place has found that just the opposite. Of course, we should have known, has occurred. That is that more students than ever are in special education, that they can't transition out in a year, and that they are also losing their native language. So, how does language influence? And I love this quote of Paulo Freire, who in his talking book with Ira Shore, 1987, this book is called A Pedagogy for Liberation, and in it they dialogue, and he said, who named the language of the elite as the correct, as the standard? They did, of course, but why not call it upper class dominating English instead of standard English? And that's an important lesson for all of us, because it's not just about English, it's about whatever is called a standard in any language. So all of this means that rather than being colorblind, language blind, gender blind, social class blind, and so forth, we need to instead build on students' sociocultural realities in pedagogy and curriculum and other policies and practices. In literacy education, for example, this includes using literature that reflects students' backgrounds and interests and tastes. For example, the growing inclusion of hip-hop culture in the United States, and discourse in teaching everything from English language arts to science, and also including students as co-constructors of curriculum and pedagogy and as co-researchers in investigating their contexts of family, community, and school. Because education, especially public education, must be about social justice. So I just want to take a moment to say a little bit about what I mean by that, because everybody's throwing this term around as if there is, a general understanding of it. And now, when I travel around the United States and I speak to people and go to colleges of education and to school systems, they all say that they are for social justice. So for me, social justice in education is a set of beliefs, attitudes, dispositions, and behaviors. Behaviors are really important about teaching and learning and about students that should form the basis of the pedagogy and curriculum. And for me, it consists of four interrelated components. First, it challenges, confronts, and disrupts misconceptions, untruths, and stereotypes that lead to and perpetuate structural inequality and discrimination. It provides all students with the resources that they need to learn to their full potential. And those resources are both material resources, but also emotional resources. Letting students understand that they are capable, that there should be nothing in their way of learning. But it doesn't just provide students, because usually that's what we think of as social justice, giving, right? But it also draws on students' talents and strengths, because it recognizes that all students have talents and strengths, and that all families have tons of knowledge to enrich the curriculum and pedagogy. And it creates a learning environment that promotes critical thinking and support for agency, and that supports agency for social change, so that it teaches young people that they have a part to play in, in our society, in their classrooms, in their schools, and so on. So this leads us to understanding the socio-political context of schools and society. Anybody who knows my work knows that I don't ever omit a brief discussion, at least, of these barriers to student learning. I was giving a talk the other day, and one of the teachers said that the first part of my talks are always very depressing because I talk about these things, and yet I think that we can't be wearing rose-colored glasses. We really need to understand what the context is like and what the barriers are. And of course, this is very U.S. based right now, but I think that in many societies it's becoming more and more the case. The societal barriers are a history of inequality and injustice. Of course, in the United States, that includes, for example, Jim Crow laws and segregated Mexican schools and Indian boarding schools, and the fact that enslaved Africans were not allowed to read, and so on. And all of this is a legacy that we have to be aware of. Wrong-headed reforms, I call them wrong-headed reforms, which is, for example, this focus on this obsession with high-stakes testing, I should say, because there's nothing wrong with testing, but when we have such an obsession about it that it becomes the be-all and end-all, then there's something wrong with that. But also, I think privatization and marketization and vouchers and all of these things, I think, are these barriers that get in the way. And of course, structural racism and other forms of discrimination. But there are also school-based barriers, for example, negative assumptions about families, resources that are often not based on need, but are usually, or what often happens, at least in the United States, and I know this is not true in other countries, but that because of how we finance schools, wealthier communities have better schools. And it's communities that don't have as many resources just can't give kids the kind of education that they need. And then the emotional environment. What are the messages that kids get in the schools? For example, schools are called failing schools. What does that say to kids about themselves? And I think that the hardest nut to crack are the ideological barriers that are both individual and institutional. And these include the biases and stereotypes about differences, and the idea that intelligence is fixed, that it can never change, which we know is not true, but that is a very difficult idea to challenge. So, a lot of this has to do with what Bourdieu called symbolic violence. And when young people feel that they are being violated in school and in society, of course, it's very hard for them to focus on learning. So where does that lead us? To address differences. I think there are three things that I'd like to focus on in the remainder of the time that I have today. Knowing yourself, knowing and affirming your students, and knowing and respecting your students' communities. And all of these can help in terms of the dealing with the differences in language and culture, and really getting young people to understand that they belong, that they are worthwhile. So how do you, as teachers and as teacher educators and as policymakers and as administrators and so on, address those differences? And I think the first step always is knowing yourself and asking yourself questions. Who are you? What is your identity? How important is it to you? Why or why not? Have you investigated your own identity, for example, your own privileges, your blind spots, your biases that can get in the way of your work with students? Have you researched your family history? Why would that be important to your teaching? And I want to just recommend Christine Slater's book, White Bread. which is a very good book, actually, that that I read and I know is being used in some teacher education courses. So it's a novel, and Christine Slater, of course, is a well-known researcher and educator in multicultural education and teacher education. And she wrote this novel about Jessica, a teacher, a young teacher, who goes into her family's past because she finds a 100-year-old letter. And she's teaching in a bicultural community. She finds that her family history says a lot about the kinds of privileges that her family had, even though they were immigrants and they had a difficult time. But because they were white, it was, put them in an easier place. And so she begins to grapple with culture and with racism, and principally through discussions with a Mexican-American teacher. So, learning about your students, I think, which was the next thing. Knowing and learning about your students. So you have to ask questions. As I said, there are no generic students. There are students who come with their identities, their cultures, their experiences, their abilities, with everything about them. Their families walk in with them, if not physically, at least emotionally. And so we need to know about them. We need to know, who are they? Why are they here? Why are there people here? And I'll give you a little example of that. When I was at the University of Massachusetts, I taught a course called Teaching About the Puerto Rican Experience. And, I thought it was very important that we have a pretty big Puerto Rican community in Western Massachusetts. And there are some teachers who teach mostly Puerto Rican students and know nothing about them or about their history. And I'm not talking about superficial aspects of culture, that we celebrate through King's Day. Okay, that's nice, but that doesn't tell you very much. Or that we eat certain foods. Well, that's good, but what does that tell you about the student sitting in front of you? And so in this course, we delved into the history, and we would talk about, like, why are there more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than in Puerto Rico? How could you teach students who are from this community and not know that? I think it's important. But I'm just using the example of Puerto Rico as just because that's a course that I used to teach. But I think we could ask the same thing about students from every single background who are in our classrooms. And so that means that teaching is about learning always, and that you need to be lifelong learners. Learn about the students who are sitting in front of you so that you can be a better teacher for them. So, like, what is their history in the society? How are they doing in school? What, if anything, is keeping them back? Now, the usual culprits that are cited are their language, of course. Well, they don't speak English. Their culture. Their culture doesn't value education according to the conventional wisdom, which is absolutely not true. Their family structure, or the fact that they don't have books at home, that their fathers don't live with them, that they're lazy, unmotivated, not smart, etc. Those are the usual culprits. Instead of looking at, as I said before, the kinds of policies and practices, first of all, that brought them here, and then that put them in particular communities of poverty often, and that just didn't give them the resources that they need. So, I always go back to this book because it really explains so well what I'm talking about. And this book is 44 years old now, by William Ryan. It's called Blaming the Victim. And in the 1960s, when I started teaching, the most popular term for describing young people who weren't doing well in school is to say, especially kids of color, was to say that they were culturally deprived. And William Ryan wrote, "We are dealing, it would seem, not so much with culturally deprived children as with culturally depriving schools. And the task to be accomplished is not to revise, amend, and repair deficient children, but to alter and transform the atmosphere and operations of the schools to which we commit these children. And I'm sorry to say that the same is still true in too many places. So then I think the third part is to learn about the communities and cultures. This is an article that I just wanted to let you know about by Chris Gutierrez and Barbara Rogoff called Cultural Ways of Learning, Individual Traits or Repertoires of Practice. And they argue that culture is a process, it's not a product. And that what we need is that knowledge and awareness of the history and the valued practices of students and the communities. And so, again, it makes sense to learn about the particular students in your classroom. So not just to learn about, all African American students, all Vietnamese students, all, whatever, as well as their families and prior experiences and so on. Because there's general agreement on the practices used by the most effective teachers, and many of them focus on caring and trustful relationships among students and teachers. And so some of these practices are related to knowing about their families and communities. So, for example, respecting and being interested in students' cultural backgrounds and personal experiences. And there are lots of ways of doing that. For example, my daughter, who is a teacher, begins her classes by giving the students a letter, beginning at the beginning of the school year, about who she is and why she's a teacher and why she became a teacher and something about her family. And then she invites the students to write her a letter. And that is a great way to learn about them, especially things that she might never have known. That's just one little example, but I think these are the kinds of things that teachers need to do if they're really interested in working with students of all backgrounds and taking those differences into account. So also encouraging and supporting students' higher order learning. Rather than always thinking that they have to work on basic skills before they can do, more higher learning. And building on students' prior knowledge, it's really important, and yet a lot of kids, when they go to school, the teachers do not build on their prior knowledge, but insist on their, learning a different kind of curriculum, which is fine as long as you build on what they already know. That's one of the tenets of how people learn. And I'm not saying that they need to stay there, but they need to at least begin there. I think using ability grouping sparingly and flexibly, and then engaging families in their children's learning. But again, this is, we need to look at how we define family engagement, because often family engagement is described in a very middle-class way. And we need to think about it in ways that make sense to families. The other day when a couple of months ago, I was giving a talk, a teacher educator said that he started out as a first grade teacher years ago, and he didn't know how to engage families. And so he started just brewing a pot of coffee and having it in his classroom, and the parents started coming in. And that, doing something like that is cultural. I mean, he was talking about Latino parents, but I think a lot of parents would come in that way. So finding ways to engage families is really important. I think that targeted professional development is important. A lot of professional development is not appreciated by teachers because it's not something that they've asked for or that they're interested in. And so I think you need to look at, for example, how inquiry groups can be helpful. So, for example, I did a wonderful inquiry group, wonderful because of the teachers who were involved, with Boston high school teachers many years ago, about 12 years ago now. And it was very transformative for all of us because they got to define what it was that they wanted to study and how. And it made a big difference. That's something that we wrote about in What Keeps Teachers Going, because that's the question that I started with. But then when you start with that question, you get into all sorts of issues about the students as well. So, this collaborative and evidence-based problem solving as related to race, ethnicity, and other differences is really important. And yet in so many cases, teachers and administrators and other educators are wary of speaking about race and other differences. They're afraid that they're going to make a mistake. They're afraid that it's going to open up a Pandora's box. But interestingly, such discussions, I think, are essential to a diversity-responsive school culture. And although teachers may be reluctant to begin this conversation, students are often very eager to engage in these things because they don't otherwise get the chance to do this. So, here I would recommend, for example, a book by Micah Pollock called Everyday Anti-Racism, where she seeks to respond to a fundamental conundrum in U.S. education. And so she writes the following: if we want schools to be vehicles for countering racial inequality, when and how should we be colorblind, and when and how should we be race conscious? And so I think that's an important question because often the answer is to be colorblind because that's a safe route. And we think that being colorblind is being fair. But it isn't necessarily being fair because it means not taking into account what students are bringing to their education. And another way for to engage families is to make sure that those policies and practices that we use with parents are responsive to racial and ethnic diversity. And so making sure that we don't just talk about cake sales, for example, and fundraisers, and paying, the PTO fee every year, but to try to find ways to engage parents that they can really relate to. Now, because there's abundant evidence that students benefit from family engagement, but what kind? And that's a question that I think, is very important to answer. So, developing family involvement strategies that are responsible to racial and ethnic and language diversity. Educators need to learn about their students' families by communicating with them consistently and respectfully, making positive assumptions about the families rather than negative assumptions, and learn about the communities in which they teach by becoming familiar with the resources in those communities. So, for example, I think a great professional development strategy is to take a walk in the community where you teach, because you can find out lots and lots of things by doing that. So these are just some of the ways that I think we can be responsive. And I mentioned some of this. Now, this is actually the way that I defined culture way back in 1992, and I think it's still pretty good. The ever-changing values, traditions, social and political relationships, and worldview created, shared, and transformed by a group of people bound together by a combination of factors that can include a common history, geographic location, language, social class, and religion, among other identities. And so this is what it means to learn about culture. It's not just, that people eat rice and beans. That's okay, but that certainly is not enough. And I mentioned targeted professional development, especially inquiry groups where teachers have a say. Now, I see that this project is co-sponsored by the National Writing Project, and I think that is an excellent model for professional development, not only for people in literacy. I have known people who were health teachers and math teachers and taught all sorts of things, kindergarten teachers and high school teachers of history and science and so on, and who engaged in the National Writing Project because it is a way of engaging in your own writing to learn about teaching with a group of your peers. So, that is a great collaborative problem-posing way to address differences. Witnessing effective practice, I think, is really important for all teachers. Go and visit other teachers who are doing interesting things and who are not afraid to talk about differences. For example, I heard of a teacher who, even a first grade teacher, was talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. That's important, for all kids to know, I think. But she did it in a way that was so appropriate for young children, because everybody knows about this, but yet it's not talked about in school. Okay, so those are the points that I wanted to make, and I think that I'm out of time. And I would be happy to engage in questions and comments with anybody who's interested.
Thank you, Dr. Nieto, for your insightful and engaging presentation. We now invite Dr. Nieto to respond to the questions that participants have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type in your questions in the Q&A section facilitated by Dr. Christy Pace. Christy?
Thanks, India. What a great presentation. Dr. Nieto, we have time for a few questions from our audience. And one of our audience members asks this question. I like the idea of being my language and my languages. When a language is mine, even if I'm not native, how can it be a foreign language to me?
Well, there really are no foreign languages in the United States. So I don't know if that's what she meant. Can you and let me explain what I mean by that. The United States has hundreds has millions of speakers of hundreds of other languages, and so there really is no foreign language. We speak all sorts of languages, and it's important to honor them. So is that what she meant? Do you know?
Yes, I believe so. I think that's exactly right. We have another question. One of our audience members asks, Dr. Nieto, where can my students find a list of multicultural children's books that can help their students become aware of and value the cultures of the students in their classrooms?
Well, I think that there's some excellent resources. I would definitely encourage them to go to Rethinking Schools. This is a resource for teachers where they can get these titles. Also to Teaching Tolerance, they have wonderful resources, and they've been working on a curriculum that I don't know. I think that actually goes along with the Common Core, but doesn't necessarily have to, and that is very multicultural and anti-racist. So I would definitely go to Teaching Tolerance. Language Arts has wonderful articles and also has book reviews of children's books and also professional books. So those are some of the resources. I'm sure that people here know others, and maybe they can add to them.
Thank you, Dr. Nieto. Another audience member wanted to know, and based on what your comment just was, this leads into our next question. Is it possible to have democratic education in a political system that continues to standardize teaching and learning?
Well, I think that is our challenge, isn't it? And so we have to say that, yes, it is possible. We have to make it possible. But it's difficult because of those practices and policies that we have. But if we really believe in democratic education, we have to do everything we can to make it possible. So that means you can start in your own classroom. You can start in groups with other teachers. You can go to the courts. You can picket. You can take to the streets. There are lots and lots of ways to create democracy, and we've seen that lately also in the political sphere. But you can start in your classroom. You can start by teaching what democracy is all about, because we talk about it as if everybody knew what it was, but we don't let kids practice it. So I think starting in the classroom is a very good idea, but that doesn't mean we have to stay there.
Thank you for that response. So another audience member, this person has another question. This person asks, how important do you think high school teachers think family engagement is? It seems like the concept, this person says, it seems like the concept is discussed more at the elementary level.
Yeah, that is a great question, and I agree that it is talked about more at the elementary level, but it's a different thing at the high school level and at the middle school level. Parents are involved or can be involved in different ways. So, for example, they can be involved by helping with the curriculum, just sending letters home and asking parents questions, or inviting them to activities in the school, whether the activities include their own children or not, inviting them to plays, to discussions, to some of the activities that the kids are doing, whether it's about the curriculum or extracurricular activities. But it is important to still engage parents, because you find out so much about what's happening with the students. Of course, if you're a high school teacher, you cannot visit 150 parents like some elementary school teachers can visit their kids' families. But you can bring them in for different activities. So I think that is a way for teachers to start thinking creatively about how they can engage families, because family engagement is always important, even if it's done in a different way.
Thanks for that response. And we have time for just a couple more. One audience member asks, I have read that there is no one agreed upon definition of culture. Do you agree? Why is this, and how do you define culture?
Well, I did define culture, so I don't know if you were here when I did. And I think it is such a difficult concept that it is hard to define, but that's why we have to make it make sense for us, and that's why I defined it, just like I defined social justice, because there's so many, with social justice, people don't even say how they define it. With culture, I thought long and hard about what to include. And so hopefully you can go back to one of the slides and see, how I defined it. It is a slippery concept, and I think we need to have more discussions about it so that we're more or less on the same page about what culture is. I think we also need to be on the same page about what it is not. It is not a deficit. It is not valuing learning, for example. I've never known people not valuing learning, but that might be the case somewhere, but I don't think so. And I think that different cultures have different practices, and that's what we need to look at. And what can we learn from that, especially as teachers?
Thank you. Yes, you did address that portion of the question, and I really appreciate you responding to that. Another audience member asks, and you did hit on this as well, but there's another part to the question that this person is interested in. In my district, some of the parents do not even speak to their kids because they want them to learn English and because they feel inadequate in speaking English. They shy away from interacting with their kids because of this. What can we do to help parents see the value of conversing with their kids no matter what language they speak?
Yeah, such an important question. I think that parents pick up the message from schools and from society that their kids better learn English and better learn it right away, even if they have to drop their native language. And so I think a school, and this doesn't just rely on an individual teacher, but an entire school can make a big difference in that, in all sorts of ways. For example, having programs in the language of the students or some of the students, or having different programs, or labeling things in the school in the languages that the children speak, having translators and interpreters for the families, sending books home in the language that the children speak, or making them available to them during the class, having tutors come in not just to teach English, but to read stories in the native language of the kids. There are so many things that a school can do to say, look, we value your language, your languages, and we want you to keep speaking them. That's not the message that most parents get, and so because of that, they really want their kids to only learn English. Now, it is important to reinforce that, yes, all kids living in the United States need to learn English. That is absolutely essential. But that doesn't mean that they need to forget or drop their native language. And that's too often the message that we're giving them and their families.
Thank you. And this next question piggybacks off of that. Audience member asks, what should a teacher do when a student in class does not want to talk about his or her culture, or when he or she does not want the teacher to talk about her culture?
I think it's really important how a teacher addresses this and how a teacher focuses on the differences in the classroom. So, pointing out a student who speaks a particular language in front of the entire class might not be the most productive way to proceed. But, just a casual comment to the student at a different time, like, oh, it's so great that you speak Korean, really gives a message. But that doesn't mean that you need to announce it in front of the whole class, because kids, want to fit in. And so you might, teachers might talk about, in general, about how great it is that some kids speak other languages, and how important it is that we all learn different languages. Inviting parents into the classroom, to talk to the kids and maybe mention how they speak another language. These are subtler ways of addressing language differences without pointing to particular kids who might be embarrassed. As a kid, I was certainly embarrassed. I would not have wanted a teacher to point. Teachers did, but what they pointed out was, we don't speak Spanish here. You have to speak English. And so when you get this message all the time, you don't want to, confess that you speak another language. So, if you have, for example, literature in the classroom, if you have posters, make them in other languages also. And that also gives kids the message that their language is valued, and that the fact that they speak another language is important, and that they should keep on doing it without your targeting specific students.
Those are all great ideas. With the political elections in full swing, One participant asks, why do you think the public is following Donald Trump, especially given his views on multiculturalism?
Well, gee, that's, I could be here for an hour talking about that, but I'll just say that I think that there's a lot of fear in the country, and part of that fear is because of the growing diversity. There is a fear of loss of power and privilege, and that they are, quote, taking over. So I think that it's feeding that fear, because also people are seeing that their children are not doing as well as they did, and that their grandchildren are not doing as well as they did, and that has to do with the economic situation and not so much the political situation. So there are a lot of reasons for it, but I think that shouldn't deter us, obviously, from the job at hand, which we need to keep on pushing and articulating, that we need to pay attention to those differences in a positive, affirming way, so that all kids get the message that they are valued.
Thank you. And we have time for just one more question. And this audience member asks, Dr. Nieto, what do you think would be an ideal education?
Wow. You can't answer that question so easily, because it depends on the teacher, depends on the children, it depends on the city, town, or neighborhood, it depends on, who the kids are. But in general, I would say that an ideal education is an education that demands a great deal of students, that believes that they can do their best, and that takes advantage of the talents and skills that they already have, whether those are cultural, linguistic, mathematical, whatever skills that they have. We have to take advantage of those, and just push kids to make sure that they understand that they are worthwhile. And so, and another real important component of an ideal education is for teachers to love their students. That is, to really believe in them and to have high hopes for them, and to have caring relationships with them. That's an ideal education, and that caring will be manifested in different ways, depending on the kids, depending on who they are, where they live, and what they need.
You did a great job answering that. That was quite a question to respond to. And actually, looking at the time, we do have time for just this final question. I said that would be the final one, but we do have time for this one. I've understood some of your writing is making a point that race and ethnicity as categories that schools use to limit students. Could you please discuss the idea in relation to culturally relevant pedagogy?
Well, let me mention my book, which is called Finding Joy in Teaching Students of Diverse Backgrounds, Culturally Responsive and Socially Just Practices in U.S. Classrooms. So I hope that you look that up. In that book, I interviewed teachers from around the country who are culturally responsive teachers, and they do it in all different ways. Like, one teacher gives every student, he was a sixth grade teacher, recently retired, and he gave every student his cell phone number and his home number, and said that they could call him anytime. Now, that another teacher would never do something like that, and that's okay, because there's no template. There's no one way to be a culturally responsive teacher. Another teacher made sure that she had left 10 minutes at the end of the day to talk with her students about anything that they wanted to talk about. That's culturally responsive. There's a million ways to do this. The point is to find out who the kids are. So we go back to where I started. Find out who the kids are and then be responsive to that, and then you're culturally responsive. I mean, some kids, usually the kids in the majority, the default, as I called them before, are kids who do have a culturally responsive pedagogy because they happen to be in the majority. But that doesn't mean that that everybody has this. So I think knowing the kids and knowing, learning about them, and then responding to them individually and collectively.
Thank you, Dr. Nieto, for taking all of these wonderful questions and for your responses to them.